Nope, our sound's not coming through, Tim.
Oh, I know why. One minor detail that I seem to forget every now and then.
Pushing the button.
Yeah, clicking to share the sound.
Welcome to another episode of Sounds Reasonable. I'm your host, Dr. Brad, and I'm joined in the production of our weekly show by Tim, Tracy, and Abby. We're all members of the Free Thought community, and our Sounds Reasonable website can be found on Facebook. Do you experience frequent irrational thoughts, a pervasive belief in a divine skydance, an insatiable urge to read horoscopes, perform spells, speak in tongues, or pray? Fortunately, you are now listening to the cure for these ailments. Sounds Reasonable. This show is dedicated to bringing you, the listener, the latest news in free thought, science, logic and reason, and politics and religion. And of course, we encourage you to share your thoughts with us after every episode by posting comments and asking questions on our Facebook page. What is free thought? What does it mean to be a free thinker? The dictionary definition is a person who forms opinions about religion based on reason, independent of tradition, authority, or established belief. Here's Christopher Hitchens' working definition. Our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. We do not rely solely upon science and reason because these are necessary rather than sufficient factors. But we distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. We may differ on many things, but what we respect is free inquiry, open-mindedness, and the pursuit of ideas for their own sake. We will now move on to our science news segment. And remember that the scientific mind is one that allows its perceptions of reality to be constrained by good evidence and good argument. I would imagine that everyone on our panel, as well as everyone in our listening audience, has seen Jurassic Park. You guys have all seen Jurassic Park, right?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. But what if we could truly generate a similar park, but in a different era? Producing a Pleistocine park may just be a reality. So what might we put in this park? So Tim, could we see some photos of what we might be able to put in Pleistocine Park?
You bet.
So here's a skeleton of the saber-toothed tiger. And that would be a scary, scary thing indeed to see those teeth coming for you.
Definitely.
What else might we put in there? Here's a cave drawing of a woolly rhinoceros. So note the fact that if we have a cave drawing of a woolly rhinoceros, that means that man and these creatures did coexist. So let's see a artist's conception of one, and there it is. Okay, so there's the woolly rhinoceros. And note we got very, very pronounced horns on this animal.
Oops. Sorry.
And the last one, which will be the subject of the story I'm going to relate, is the woolly mammoth. Now, I in particular like the mammoth for this reason, being a native of Nebraska. Nebraska per acre has more mammoth bones than anywhere else in the world. And you can view these magnificent creatures, skeletons in our museum in Lincoln. Okay, so go back to normal frame here. Thank you, Tim. Now, the Jurassic period was 200 to 145 million years ago, but the Pleistocene period was only 2.5 million to 12,000 years ago. The significance of that is in the survival of DNA intact enough to sequence. Our science news segment comes from Nature News. It was published February 17th of this year, authored by Ewan Callaway, and is titled Million-Year-Old Mammoth Genomes Shatter Record for Oldest Ancient DNA. The million-year-old genome is here. Mammoth teeth preserved in eastern Siberia permafrost have produced the oldest ancient DNA on record, pushing the technology close to, but perhaps not past its limits. Genomic DNA extracted from a trio of tooth specimens excavated in the 1970s has identified a new kind of mammoth that gave rise to a later North American species. The findings were published in Nature on February 17th. Quote, I love the paper. I've been waiting for that paper for what, 8 years now, said Ludovic Orlando, an ancient DNA specialist at the Center for Anthropobiology and Genomics of Toulouse in France, who co-led a 2013 effort that sequenced the previous oldest ancient DNA, a genome from a 560,000 to 780,000 year old horse leg bone. I'm pleased to lose the record because it was a heavy one, he says. Researchers had suspected that ancient DNA could survive beyond 1 million years if the right sample could be found. Once an organism dies, its chromosomes shatter into pieces that get shorter over time. Eventually, the DNA strands become so small that even if they can be extracted, they lose their information content. Orlando's team found that fragments as short as 25 DNA letters in their horse bone from the Canadian Yukon Territory could still be interpreted. They estimated that million-year-old remains preserved in the constant cold of permafrost, which slows DNA fragmentation, should also contain DNA fragments of that length. Quote, my only doubt, does such a sample exist, Orlando says. So the next subsection is entitled Decadal Dream, or a 10-year long dream. So Love Dalen, an evolutionary geneticist at the Swedish Museum of Natural History in Stockholm, have been dallying with the idea of sequencing very old mammoth remains since he first encountered a specimen of them in 2007. The samples his team sequenced, one from an early woolly mammoth, and two assigned to a precursor known as steppe mammoths, had been excavated by the Russian paleontologist Andrei Shear. Dalen hoped that DNA from the samples could capture the evolution of woolly mammoths and other species in action, but he was skeptical because of previous bad experiences with much younger remains found in permafrost. Quote, it's not like everything found in the permafrost always works. The vast majority of samples have crap DNA, he says. And indeed, two of the three mammoth molars from Shear's excavation, retrieved from sediments more than 1 million years old, contain so little DNA that Dalen says he would have discarded them had they been younger. But thanks to advances in sequencing technology and bioinformatics, his team managed to obtain 49 million base pairs of nuclear DNA from the oldest sample, found near a village called Kristovica, and 884 million base pairs from another tooth called Attica. Analysis of the DNA suggested that the Kristovica sample was 1.65 million years old, and the Attica sample was around 1.3 million. The third sample, a 600,000-year-old woolly mammoth tooth, dubbed, I wish the Russians weren't naming all these, challenges my pronunciation skills, but the woolly mammoth tooth dubbed Chukoya produced nearly 3.7 billion base pairs of DNA, more than the length of its 3.1 billion base pair genome. And of course, that's highly significant there because that allows us to have a full genomic coverage. So we potentially have what you would need if so desired to actually reconstruct this animal. From their shape, the two oldest teeth look like they belong to steppe mammoths, a European species that researchers think predated woolly mammoths, and Columbian mammoths, a North American species. But their genomes painted a more complicated picture. The Attica specimen was part of the lineage that gave rise to woolly mammoths, but the Kristovica specimen clearly was not. Damon's team found it belonged to an entirely new lineage. We can't say, quote, we can't say it's a different species, but it sure looks like it, he says. Although the Kristovica sample is from Russia, he suspects the lineage became isolated from other steppe mammoths in North America. The team found the Columbian mammoths traced half their history to the Kristovica mammoth lineage and the other half to woolly mammoths. Dalen estimates that the two lineages mixed more than 420,000 years ago. The idea that new species can come from can form through mixing and not just splitting from a single parent species is gaining currency among evolutionary biologists. But this is the first evidence for hybrid speciation from ancient DNA, says Orlando. This is amazing. Hendrik Poinar, an ancient DNA specialist at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada, says different mammoth species probably routinely hybridized when glacial expansion brought them together. His team has found evidence the later woolly and Columbian mammoths occasionally interbred. And of course, we've had modern day evidence for the production of hybrids this way. So in fact, in our at UNK, Joe Springer was studying shrew species and the role of hybridization in producing new species right in Nebraska. Now, the future of ancient DNA, even though researchers have been expecting a million-year-old genome, crossing that threshold is important, says Vivian Sloan, a paleogeneticist at Tel Aviv University in Israel. There's a difference between what we think is possible and actually showing it. Tom Vandervalk, a bioinformatician at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, who led the mammoth tooth work with evolutionary biologist Patricia Peknarova and David Diaz del Molino, hopes that it will encourage other labs. Quote, it is a symbolic barrier that I hope can inspire and motivate other groups that have ideas about really deep time sequencing. By crossing the million-year threshold, ancient DNA researchers might be able to access the early histories of other mammals, big and small, says Dalen. Very old permafrost samples of musk oxen, moose, and lemmings are now on his lab's radar. So we could add those species to our Pleistocine park possibilities. The mammoth DNA does not represent the oldest biomolecular information from the fossil record. In 2016, researchers reported protein sequences from 3.8 million year old ostrich eggshells from Tanzania. And in 2019, another team decoded proteins from a 1.77 million year old rhinoceros tooth from Georgia. Protein sequences tend to be much less informative about an organism's ancestry than DNA, but protein molecules are much hardier, so researchers can use them to glean insights from very old fossils found in places even with no permafrost. The ostrich and rhino samples both come from archaeological sites famous for hominin remains. The chances of finding million-year-old remains of ancient human relatives in the permafrost are rather low, researchers say. But Dalen thinks that the right environment, such as a deep cave, could yield samples that old. Early Neanderthal remains from a Spanish cave dated to 430,000 years ago represent the oldest DNA from an ancient human relative discovered so far. Finding a hominin in the sort of ideal context for preservation as permafrost would be a dream, says Sloan. As for the likely limit of ancient DNA, Dalen says that it's easy to determine, 2.6 million years. That's the limit of the permafrost. Before that, it was too warm. So what do you think, guys? We're going to produce Pleistocene Park here soon?
So I read a couple years ago about the idea of doing this. I guess they had a woolly mammoth DNA, and they were thinking about doing some CRISPR editing, gene editing with elephant fetus or baby or something. Or, I mean, obviously an egg or a zygote at the time, but I never actually heard what had happened to that and if that followed through. Does anybody else remember? And I mean, is this something that we'll continue to do?
Yeah, I remember reading or hearing about that, and they were just going to kind of selectively breed out the elephant.
Yeah.
But I've never heard anything after that on it. I don't know, if Dr. Brad, if you have.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything more about that. You know, the amazing thing is, you know, just even 10 years ago, people would have said this is absolute science fiction. But with the rapid development of sequencing technology with CRISPR, and then you know, you take into account that we can rather easily sequence the entire genomes of any extant organism now. So you take the elephant, you compare the sequence of the elephant with the woolly mammoth, and you can start introducing changes into the elephant sequence rather than having to reconstruct the entire thing from scratch. And voila, you're going to have a woolly mammoth.
Right.
So I mean, it's just incredible. And the same would be true with the rhinoceros. Yeah, so you could generate a woolly rhinoceros. You know, the giant sloth was one that was rather prominent in that era. And the others that we already mentioned, saber-toothed tiger. You know, we obviously can sequence in the tiger DNA and then see what the differences were between the tiger and the saber-tooth. So absolutely amazing, and not at all out of the realm of possibility anymore.
I guess what the real question is, like, I mean, we are coming to a time where the science is available and it is possible. But I think there's a lot of people that would argue we shouldn't do it. And I mean, there's various reasons, whether they're religious or just, you know, personal beliefs, or whether, you know, science is going too far. But I don't know, that's like an interesting question. I guess, what are your guys' thoughts on, even if it was possible, even if it works, should we?
Great question.
So, yeah, it is a good question, and I guess you would have to look at okay, so what environmental impact would this animal have if it got away, if it got out? Now, of course, there'd have to be two, because if you didn't have a male and a female, you're not going to make any more. So you get one gets away out in the environment, and unless for some reason it could produce hybrids with its like species or sister species, but
first of all, I think it's hard to imagine how it would quote unquote get away.
right. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be rather easy to spot.
Yeah. Yeah. Not a lot of places to hide.
Quote unquote broke out of the cage. I think it'd be pretty easy to spot.
Okay, but look at Jurassic Park. I mean,
yeah, there you go.
What happened there, right?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Jurassic Park, because, of course, that was the question you asked was a key question that was asked in the movie by Jeff Goldblum.
Right.
And I believe his quote was, "You were so excited about the fact that you could, you didn't think about whether you should." And so anyway, so the question is, why would we do it? Okay, so why would you do it? And I think it might be a question to ask. And to me, it's a simple matter of wanting to know, what these organisms were like. What was their physiology? How are they different from the existing species? How did they evolve into the current species that we have? Why did they go extinct? I mean, there's a huge number of questions, obviously, that could be answered by being able to examine these organisms as living organisms.
I also think that we could look at some of the epigenetic factors influencing these organisms, because, I mean, what their genes code for, by themselves doesn't really tell the whole story about, like what you said, their real life physiology and morphology. So I think it would be pretty interesting as well to see what genes are actually turned on, how they actually develop, how similar they are to species today. I mean, a lot of that could be key insight into how genes really work that we don't quite understand yet.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I could see if the technology is developed to do this, that I could envision it kind of being directed toward maybe endangered, recovering endangered species and loss of species lost that are vital habitats now. Definitely would be a big value there for that as well, using that technology.
All right. Any other comments?
I'll just agree with Tim there. I think that's a good point, is looking forward, especially given how much damage humans have done to some species. Can we mitigate some of that using this technology?
Sure. And of course, we in recent time, we've driven several species to extinction. Can we bring them back?
Right.
So, all right. Well, with that, I think we'll take our first break. So I'll be right back with more Sounds Reasonable.
All alive. The devil's in the detail, lingered inside. Oh, a holy crime. But how can I hide you without an alibi? It's a reckless fight without an alibi. brought me alive, but got no alibi. It's a rebel's fight without an alibi. Took my innocence without an alibi.
And we're back with more Sounds Reasonable on February 28th, 2021. Thank goodness, February is gone.
Yeah, it just flew by.
Yeah, just flew by.
It did.
Well, I remember watching CNN on November 9th, 1989, and seeing people walking on top of the Berlin Wall, drinking champagne and hitting the wall with sledgehammers. Frankly, I never thought I would see that day come in my lifetime, and now it's been many years ago. This marked the end of Soviet rule in Europe and signified the crumbling of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. A similar fate may now be in store for the Republican Party in the United States. Tracy has the story. So Tracy, why do certain people think we are witnessing the end of the Republican Party? You don't have your sound on, Tracy.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. You're good.
This story comes from theatlantic.com entitled, and it was published February 25th, 2021, obviously. The Republican Party is now in its end stages. The GOP has become in form, if not in content, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union of the late 1970s. That was the subhead. We are living in a time of bad metaphors. Everything is fascism or socialism, Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union. Republicans, especially, want their followers to believe that America is on the verge of a dramatic time, a moment of great conflict, such as 1968, or perhaps even worse, 1860. The drama is the point, of course. No one ever says, we're living through 1955. Ironically, the GOP is indeed replicating another political party in another time, but not as the heroes they imagine themselves to be. The Republican Party has become, in form, if not in content, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union of the late 1970s. I can already hear the howls about individual comparisons. I do not mean that modern American Republicans are communists. Rather, I mean that the Republicans have entered their own kind of end-stage Bolshevism as members of a party that is now exhausted by its failures, cynical about its own ideology, authoritarian by reflex, controlled as a personality cult by failing old man, and looking for new adventures to rejuvenate its fortunes. No one thinks much about the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, and no one really should. This was a time referred to by the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, as the Vremya Zastoya, the era of stagnation. By that point, the Soviet Communist Party was a spent force, and ideological conviction was mostly for chumps and fanatics. A handful of party ideologues and the senior officers of the Soviet military might still have believed in Marxism-Leninism, the melding of aspirational communism to one-party dictatorship, but by and large, Soviet citizens knew that the party's formulations about the rights of all people were just window dressing for rule by a small circle of old men in the Kremlin. The party itself was not a party in any Western sense, but a vehicle for a cabal of elites with a cult of personality at its center. The Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev was an utterly mediocre man, but by the late 1970s, he had cemented his grip on the Communist Party by elevating opportunists and cronies around him who insisted publicly and privately that Brezhnev was a heroic genius. Factories and streets and even a city were named for him, and he promoted himself to the top military rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union. He awarded himself so many honors and medals that, in a common Soviet joke of the time, a small earthquake in Moscow was said to have been caused by Brezhnev's metal festooned military overcoat falling off his hanger. The elite leaders of the supposedly classless society were corrupt plutocrats, a mafia dressed in Marxism. The party was infested by careerists, and its grip on power was defended by propagandists, that's right, who used note phrases such as real socialism and Western imperialism so often that almost anyone could write an editorial in Pravda or Red Star merely by playing a kind of Soviet version of Mad Libs. News was tightly controlled. Soviet radio, television, and newspaper figures plowed on through stories that were utterly detached from reality. That makes me sad. Regularly extolling the successes of Soviet agriculture, even as the country was forced to buy food from the capitalists, including the hated Americans. Members of the Communist Party who questioned anything or expressed any sign of unorthodoxy could be denounced by name, or more likely, simply fired. They would not be executed. This was not Stalinism after all, but some were left to rot in obscurity in some make-work exile job, even retiring as forgotten comrade pensioner. The deal was clear. Pump the party's nonsense and enjoy the good life, or squawk and be sent to manage a library in Kazakhstan. This should all sound familiar. The Republican Party has, for years, ignored the ideas and principles it once espoused, to the point where the 2020 GOP convention simply dispensed with the fiction of a platform and instead declared the party to be whatever President Donald Trump said it was. Like Brezhnev, Trump has grown in status to become a heroic figure among his supporters. If the Republicans could create the rank of Marshal of the American Republic and strike a medal for a hero of American culture, Trump would have them both by now. A GOP that once prided itself on its intellectual debates is now ruled by the turgid formulations of what the Soviets would have called their leading cadres, including ideological watchdogs such as Tucker Carlson and Mark Levin. Like their Soviet predecessors, a host of dull and dogmatic cable outlets, screechy radio talkers, and poorly written magazines crank out the same kind of fill-in-the-blank screeds full of delusional accusations, replacing NATO and revanchism with Antifa and radicalism. Falling in line, just as in the old Communist Party, is rewarded and independence is published. The anger directed at Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger makes the silted ideological criticisms of the last century's Soviet propagandists seemed almost genteel by comparison. At least Soviet families under Brezhnev didn't add 3-page handwritten denouncements to official party reprimands. This comparison is more than a metaphor. It is a warning. A dying party can still be a dangerous party. The communist leaders in those last year of political sclerosis arrayed a new generation of nuclear missiles against NATO, invaded Afghanistan, tightened the screws on Jews and other dissidents, lied about why they shot down a civilian 747 airliner, and near the end came close to starting World War III out of sheer paranoia. The Republican Party is, for now, more a danger to the United States than to the world. But like the last Soviet-era holdouts in the Kremlin, its cadres are growing more aggressive and paranoid. They blame the spies and provocateurs for the Capitol riot, and they are obsessed with last summer's protests. Indeed, they are all fixated on all the criminals and rioters other than their own, to a point that now echoes the old Soviet lingo about antisocial elements and hooligans. They blame their failures at the ballot box not on their own shortcomings, but on fraud and sabotage as the justification for a redoubled crackdown on democracy. Another lesson from all this history is that the Republicans have no path to reform. Like their Soviet counterparts, their party is too far gone. Gorbachev tried to reform the Soviet Communist Party, and he remains reviled among the Soviet faithful to this day. Similar efforts by the remaining handful of reasonable Republicans are unlikely to fare any better. The Republican Party, to take a phrase from the early Soviet leader Leon Trotsky, should now be deposited where it belongs, in the dustbin of history. What did you guys think about those comparisons? Do you think Donald Trump is going to, I mean, I agreed with some of this, but do you think it's going to go that far?
I think it already has gone that far. I think those comparisons, those parallels are spot on.
Jeez.
So, I mean, I'm a little bit younger, and so I don't remember a lot of the Soviet propaganda from anything other than, you know, history or reading.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do see a lot of what you were saying about the Soviet Party in the current Republican Party. And it does seem like the GOP is very much propaganda filled, very much fear mongering, very much blaming, you know, someone else other than themselves for their own shortfalls. So, I mean, I do see a lot of that in our current situation. So I can't really make a probably educated comparison between the Soviet Party and the current Republican Party, but I would say that there has been a lot of extremism, and our Republican Party is extremely broken. Fractured probably would be a better word, because I think there's now different almost sects of the party where they held pretty widely different beliefs. So I don't see it really coming together again, but I'm hoping that we'll see a more moderate Republican Party coming out of this situation, and some of those extremists kind of falling to the wayside. But again, that's my hope. That's not necessarily what's going to happen.
I know, like, how scared should we be, or are there going to be enough of us to balance that out and kind of stop it before it gets too bad? Or, like, I don't know. I don't know how scared I should be.
Yeah, to me, the most troubling thing with our current system right now is it clearly allows minority rule. You compare the number of people in the United States that are represented by Democratic senators versus Republican senators, it's getting close to 2-to-1. And yet the Senate is balanced at 50-50. So that's allowing minority rule. Tim will address this in his upcoming story, which would be a quick solution to that. But the other thing that's very troubling to me is if you've been watching the CPAC conference going on, the Conservative Political Action Conference, what shows up but a golden statue of Trump? This has become a party that, quite frankly, is all but worshiping a single man.
And it's Donald Trump. I don't.
When the riots of January 6th took place, what did they do? They took down the American flag and raised a flag with Trump on it. This isn't just people talking. This is people trying to take direct action to place Trump in as a dictator.
Right.
I don't know how else you can interpret it.
I think the hope is that, well, of course, right now, if you look at independents and Democrats, they're by percentage, they're together by far a higher percentage than those that align themselves with the Republican Party. And the hope is that this that's going on within the Republican Party drives those that are more centrist away, or out or into independent. That then shrinks the percentage of those that affiliate themselves with the Republican Party. But you're right. It's just, you look at the crazies that the Republican Party and that is allowing to be their spokesperson. Green, right? I've forgotten her first name.
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff they continue to let her spout out about, it just doesn't make any sense. And I think the more they do that, the more it's going to divide the party, and maybe have it fizzle out, or at least hope fizzles out. That far right group fizzles out.
So what can we do about this?
Make it public.
Yeah.
Call them. The way, I recall, here's an example of how making things public works. The ambassador from, or not ambassador, but the prime minister from Iran came and gave a talk at Columbia University in New York a few years ago. And he was asked, how are homosexual individuals treated in Iran? And his answer was, we have no homosexuals in Iran. And the crowd just in unison burst out in absolute laughter. And so that in my view is how you do it. You show the absolute ridiculousness of these stances in a public forum as often and as best as you can. And eventually that does break through in my view. It really does.
Huh.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would say is like opening a dialogue. Not everybody responds well to that, but I have friends that are very conservative and kind of get sucked into some of the stories and fear mongering from conservative media. And in reality, they're very good people, but it's easy for them to kind of go down that direction and then like start sharing some of those beliefs. And so if you can open a dialogue with people that are kind of like still reasonable, but maybe are kind of getting sucked into that propaganda, I think that's going to help a lot too, because it'll bring maybe the majority of people back to reason.
They're not crazy yet. I know what you're saying. Like, they're not crazy yet. Like, I have conservative family and some of them are gone. Like, they're just gone. They're like gone.
I think it would help if the mainstream media would call out the BS when it pops up. They don't do that
Right.
enough.
Exactly.
They just let it go.
Yeah, and that's exactly what needs to be done. We need that, and it's got to come. Did you happen to watch Bill Maher this Friday? Did you watch Bill
I
Maher?
didn't see it.
He had Megyn Kelly on. You remember her from Fox News?
Right.
But she's left Fox News now because it's become so crazy that she couldn't handle it anymore. But she had some really good points to bring up, and we need reasonable people to get on those types of networks. There are a couple, but unfortunately they quickly find themselves having to leave. Like Shepard Smith used to be on Fox. Now he is on MSNBC, I believe. So anyway,
They're coming.
somehow that's got to happen.
So some of them are
ratings.
coming around. Yeah.
I don't think they get ratings if that happens. I think the drama is what, pulls people in. And so having that be the solution, I don't see that as something that's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I suppose we're not going to solve it in our hour program today. So. But the only thing we can do is keep talking about it. You have to shine a light on it. You can't let it remain in the dark, or the problem will just grow.
Right.
All right. Well, Tracy, thanks so much for that story, and we'll be back with more Sounds Reasonable after this short break.
With my head again, you had your heart set on me, but these feels, they come and go, and they come so easily. Tell me what it is
No taxation without representation. I think all of us recognize that as one of the key slogans that was used to rally the colonists against the British and one of the main drivers of the War for Independence. And yet, here we are in 2021, and the U.S. has 5 territories that are U.S. possessions that pay federal taxes such as Medicare and Social Security, yet have no representation in Congress. Tim has the story. So, Tim, what's going on?
Thanks, Dr. Brad. My story comes from The Guardian and is titled New Stars on the American Flag, Fresh Hope as Puerto Rico and DC Push for Statehood. It's written by David Smith in Washington for The Guardian on Saturday, February 20th. One of the most powerful prosecutions of former U.S. President Donald Trump last week came from Stacey Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands, the first delegate from an American territory to hold the position of impeachment manager. Yet Plaskett's status meant that she was unable to vote for Trump's impeachment because she has no vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. The U.S. Virgin Islands has no representation at all in the Senate. Its residents can't even vote for president. The anonymity illustrates America's long unaddressed colonial history that leaves 5 territories floating in constitutional limbo. Their residents, most of them are people of color, effectively treated as second-class citizens. But with the impetus of last summer's protest against racial injustice and the election of election of a Democratic president, one of those territories, Puerto Rico, is aiming to become the 51st state of the Union. A parallel effort by Washington, District of Columbia, is also closer than ever to the similar goal. Quote, it's incredibly important to take a step back and look at who actually has real representation in democracy, says Stasha Rhodes, campaign manager of 51 for 51, an organization pushing for DC statehood. Quote, if you think about it, all the players that you mentioned, they all have a common thread. They're all people of color. Does America have a true democracy if so many people of color are standing outside looking in and are not able to fully participate, unquote. There are 5 inhabited U.S. territories: American Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and U.S. Virgin Islands. Apart from American Samoa, people born in the territories are U.S. citizens and pay federal taxes such as Medicare and Social Security, though not a federal tax on locally sourced income. Each territory sends a delegate to the House who can debate legislation, sit on committees, but is not able to actually vote. Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony in 1898 when it fell under U.S. control as part of the terms that ended the Spanish-American War. In 1917, the Jones Act granted Puerto Rican U.S. citizenship, and in 1952, it became a Commonwealth of the U.S., but still without voting rights in American presidential elections. Over the past half century, Puerto Rico has held 6 non-binding referendums on its status, and last November voted 52% to 47% in favor of statehood, a cause boosted by grievance over the federal government's inadequate response to Hurricane Maria in 2017. In an interview last week with Axios on HBO, Governor Pedro Pereles, I believe it's pronounced, said Congress is morally obligated to respond and predicted that a House bill will be introduced next month. George Laws Garcia, executive director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, said, "You have a bunch of unelected individuals making decisions on behalf of the people of Puerto Rico over the desires and ideas and perspectives of the local elected officials, which I think is basically blatant colonialism." Quote, "We had Hurricane Maria and the earthquakes and now COVID. And in all these instances, when Puerto Rico needs federal resources, federal support, federal action, we don't have the capacity to hold elected officials in Washington accountable for what they do, because they don't ever get any votes from Puerto Rico. And that includes the president as well as members of Congress. It is Congress that would have to approve the creation of any new state for the first time since Hawaii, which was in 1959. Republicans have cast the move as an unconstitutional power grab, likely to give Democrats 2 extra seats in the Senate. Yes. Martha McSally, then a senator for Arizona, told NBC News last year that should Puerto Rico gain statehood, Republicans will, quote, never get the Senate back again. Yay. Although Democrats control the House, a statehood bill would face a far tougher passage in the evenly divided Senate, where 60 votes are required to thwart the kill switch of a Republican filibuster. Despite progressives pointing to the racist history of the filibuster, key Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema,
Yeah, from Arizona. Yeah.
yeah, have already indicated an unwillingness to eliminate it. Garcia added, quote, the prospects of statehood are incredibly challenging, but they've been challenging for every other territory that has ever been admitted to as a state. In my lifetime, it is certainly the best possible odds that we could have. Almost all of Puerto Rico's residents are Hispanic, while nearly half of DC's are African American. But as the nation's capital, DC comes from different historical, economic, and constitutional perspectives. Its 700,000 plus residents, which is higher than the populations of Vermont and Wyoming, pay more per capita in federal income taxes than any state. They gained the right to vote in presidential elections in 1961, but still lack a voting member in the House or a voice in the Senate. The movement for DC statehood is bigger and better organized than ever before. Last June, the House passed a bill that approved it, the first time a Chamber of Commerce had advanced a DC statehood measure. It never stood a chance in the Republican-controlled Senate, but Black Lives Matter protests in Washington gave the cause added potency. Rhodes of 51 for 51 said, our most celebrated civil rights leaders were fighting for access to democracy. If you think about John Lewis, Martin Luther King, they were all fighting for access to voting and access to representation. And so here in 2021, we're still fighting in Washington, D.C. for equal representation and a clear chance at participation in democracy. One key obstacle was removed when Trump, who had vowed DC will never be a state because it would be sure to elect Democratic senators, was beaten in the presidential election by Joe Biden, who has voiced support for the campaign. Then came the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on 6th of January. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, told reporters earlier this month, if the District of Columbia could operate as a state, any governor can do is to call out the National Guard without getting the permission of the federal government. It shouldn't have to happen that way. Eleanor Holmes Norton, DC's non-voting member in the House, reintroduced the statehood bill last month, while the Democratic Senator Tom Caper of Delaware reintroduced his companion statehood bill, which currently has 39 Democratic co-sponsors. Megan Hatcher-Mays, Director of Democracy Policy for the grassroots movement Invisible, said, it's an issue of basic fairness. DC is not all government bureaucrats and lawyers. There are actually real people who live here, many of whom were tasked with cleaning up the mess after the January 6th insurrection. Those are DC residents and they have no vote in Congress at all. And so it would seem to me that it would be a pretty easy lift for every Democrat in the Senate to say that's wrong. Hatcher Mays, a former aide to Holmes Norton, added, "We need to eliminate the filibuster to make DC the 51st state. This is the closest we have ever been to getting DC statehood, and it's going to happen. It's going to happen this Congress, and it really has to happen, or otherwise the Senate is in trouble. It's really unrepresentative of the country as a whole, and making DC a state would go a long way towards fixing that problem. It's about making America a more perfect union." The issue has cast light on the Democratic deficit of the Senate, where small, predominantly white states get 2 seats each, carrying as much weight as vast racially diverse states such as California. In 2018, David Leonhardt, an opinion columnist at the New York Times, calculated that the Senate gives the average Black American only 75% as much representation as the average white American, and the average Hispanic American only 55% as much. Furthermore, in the 232-year history of the Senate, there have been only 11 Black senators, and Plaskett was the only elected Black woman at the impeachment trial. In such a context, Republican opposition to statehood has been described as a bid to protect white minority rule. Latasha Brown, co-founder of Black Votes Matter, said, "At the end of the day, you have states from Utah to Montana to others that have gained statehood early on with less question, with less critique than DC and Puerto Rico. It is a fundamental democratic flaw, and it reeks of hypocrisy. The only reason why it is a debate or even a question is because of who makes up the majority of both those places. A previous bid for DC statehood was defeated in the Democratic-controlled House by almost a 2-to-1 margin in 1993, with President Bill Clinton reluctant to engage. This time, with Biden making racial justice a priority, the mood is different. There is a sense that Democrats control the White House, Senate, and House provides a historic opportunity. Donna Brazil, a former interim chair of the Democratic National Committee, said, "This is about making America a more perfect unit. It's the oldest constitutional democracy in the world, and yet some of its citizens do not have all the full voting rights because of where they reside. If we're going to end racial injustice in America and talk about new beginnings for the country, we can't step aside old issues." Now, one of my former students is from Puerto Rico, and I've talked to her about this a little bit, but she really strongly feels that Puerto Ricans really don't want statehood, and or that it won't happen. Maybe if they don't want, but it won't happen. And so, and then a friend of hers, she contacted a friend of hers who sent me some video clips. I was trying to get him to come on the show, but he wouldn't.
Oh, that would be cool.
It would have been really cool. But I have some of his thoughts, some video clips. So I'm just going to have to share my screen and play a little bit of his thoughts as to why and what Puerto Ricans think, or at least based on their thoughts. Okay, I got to share screen. Okay. And I'm going to play a little bit of the first and then move up a little bit here.
Okay, so the issue with statehood in Puerto Rico, one of the first things that comes to mind is that, ironically enough, the pro-statehood party in Puerto Rico is and always has been aligned with the Republican Party. It's a very conservative, the pro-statehood party in Puerto Rico is a very conservative party for the most part. And I say ironic because it's, in fact, Republicans in the U.S. government, the U.S. Senate, House, and all that, the ones that are most against the idea of making Puerto Rico a state. So that's funny. I read recently that.
Okay, I'm going to move ahead here a little bit. It talks about some reasons.
What are you trying to hide?
Nothing. There's nothing to hear.
Plebiscites or whatever they're called, the
Talking about the referendum.
special elections they've held for to see if here in Puerto Rico on the island we actually want statehood. Every single one has been fraught with just inconsistencies and cheating. I'd say cheating on the part of the pro-statehood party. They leave out other options. There's been massive calls for people to abstain from voting. It's never really been, a full percentage of the voters. I think at one point, none of the above won once, simply because the pro-Commonwealth Party did not agree with how Commonwealth was defined in the options. So they actually campaigned not for to stay Commonwealth, they campaigned for none of the above. And then I think the last one, I think only like 9% of the island voted. And I think what the reaction from the US was, that's not even nearly enough of the population to really gauge what the feeling is. And honestly, I feel that even if you got 100% of the population to vote and 51% voted to become a state, doesn't really matter, because the US can still say like, yeah, but we don't want to. And that's it. Should Puerto Rico have representation, have voting representation? I think it should have voting representation. I think we don't need to become a state to have voting representation. And I'm personally do not like the idea of becoming a state. I think we should have more sovereignty, and yeah, it's very complicated. It's a very complicated subject.
The and my former student kind of has this kind of the same sentiment, that not thinking it should be statehood. I wish I would have asked him about the why he thought there was some illegal stuff that went on. I thought about that later. I should have asked. There's a little bit of another clip here. Let me know if you can hear this. Kind of talks a little bit more about maybe why they might not want statehood as well.
One of the reasons
hear that okay?
A lot of people don't want statehood also is for cultural reasons. We would lose representation in international events. For one, people here are very, very proud of seeing the Puerto Rican flag flying at these events. You see the U.S. flag. You don't see the Kentucky flag. You don't see the California flag. You see the U.S. flag. If Puerto Rico become a state, you will no longer see the Puerto Rico flag floating at these events, or Puerto Rico representing itself at these events. Pro-statehood party here has always talked about what they call they would actually try to tell they would try to tell the population, the people here, that we would actually have a special kind of statehood that would allow Puerto Rico to still participate in these international events under its own flag, which makes no sense whatsoever. They call it here Estadidad Criolla, statehood Criolla version, or Puerto Rican statehood. I don't know how to, it's not Creole, but yeah. And that makes no sense whatsoever. But that's one of the big arguments that people have, and it's one that a lot of people have strong feelings about, including myself. I mean, I'm one of those. I consider myself one of those who feels very proud of seeing the flag fly at the Olympics and all these international sporting events, or hell, beauty pageants. We've had 5 Miss Universe. Right. Little Puerto Rico has had 5 Miss Universe. That would not be the fact if we'd had to compete with 50 other states, to have a Puerto Rican represent the United States in the beauty pageants, for example, or for the Olympics. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons.
Well, they
Okay,
have
so- Yeah. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting that, and again, the same way with my student. Again, that's only 2 people, but I think there's definitely some pushback to statehood, maybe more so than what we're being told, I guess, on the island.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Tim. Plus, I just can't believe that they didn't see Trump passing out paper towels as sufficient aid. Yeah,
He was helping
what
them
was
out,
that?
throwing paper towels to the crowd.
I mean, he had to have thrown out at least 15, 20 rolls. I mean, I don't know what more he could have done.
He probably had a stiff arm the next day. Probably couldn't use his arm to drown someone. That's when he went after to assess the damage of Maria, and
That was thanks for doing that. I mean, that was an interesting perspective to hear.
Yeah.
I've actually heard similar. I mean, whether it was like podcasts or something like that, Puerto Rican people saying similar things, that they really don't want statehood, and they do, like, if they are a territory of the United States, they want representation, but they don't actually want to be a state. So I mean, I think I've heard that quite a bit too. So it seems like they have a valid point there for sure.
It'd be interesting to hear now that communist influence in the Western Hemisphere is in essence non-existent. You still kind of have Cuba in that boat, but I wonder if they would have been more receptive to it when Cuba was a threat as opposed to now.
Yeah, because we have the big military base,
Right.
in Puerto Rico.
And that's why we'll never let it go, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
They'll never be completely independent as long as we need a military base there.
Right.
But yeah, so absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much, Tim, for that story. So we'll take our last break and be back with our crazy story of the week.
I'm feeling so hollow. Don't you know? Don't you know? I'm living in shadow. Don't you know? Don't you know? I fell for fool's gold. I fell for fool's gold. What did I know? What did I know? I fell for fool's gold. I fell for fool's gold. What did I know? What did I know? And you were fool's gold. Yes, I did.
And we're back with our crazy story of the week. One way in which, quote unquote, God is characterized is by acting as a great surveillance camera in the sky. You're being watched 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But now we're being told by at least one pastor prophet that his God allowed Biden to be elected as a loyalty test. Abby has our crazy story of the week. So Abby, just how is this loyalty test supposed to work?
Well, I mean, obviously, God and Trump have a very tight close relationship, they talk. So that could be part of it. But so this story is from Dead State by Sky Palma, and it's titled Christian Prophet. God is monitoring people who think Biden won to find out who's loyal. And this is part of the Trump cult situation on Dead State. So it says, speaking on the Daily Truth Report recently, pro-Trump conspiracy theorist and self-proclaimed prophet Mark Taylor said that people's beliefs about who won the 2020 election are seen as a loyalty test to God. Why would you ever tell them to give up and tell them to apologize when the election was stolen? Taylor said, speaking of those who predicted that Trump would win, but are now walking back those predictions. We all know the election was stolen. When God has said it, or when God has said, I have given you the victory, it just needs to play out on earth as it is in heaven, right? So why, as a leader, would you ever want to give ground the enemy that was already given to you? Okay. Instead of that, why are you not teaching your people to stand in faith? Taylor continued. Right now, God's not saying a whole lot corporately right now. I'm not saying he can't speak. He can't speak individually, because he can and he will, but he's not saying a whole lot corporately.
I wonder if that's a registered corporation, God and Company or something like that. I don't know.
God's not saying anything right now. What he's telling people is to stand. I need you to stand. I'm going to find out who's loyal to me. I'm going to show you who's loyal to me and who's not. And I'm going to show you all things, all kinds of things here. That's why I believe God's being quiet. And then there is a video that he's also a QAnon, a conspiracy theorist,
No.
As well as a prophet.
What?
What a shocker.
He's very well rounded. This was also February 23rd, 2021. I forgot. But so I found this picture online, and Trump, yeah,
I'm
God,
gonna make you bigger.
but then Trump or God would come down. So I'm thinking,
Yeah. Just not getting the message.
yeah. That was hard to read.
Boy, he is.
Because it was mostly just him, quotes from him, and half of it doesn't make a ton of sense in my mind. But
I think it's the Adderall. I really think it's the Adderall. He should stop snorting it and just swallow it like normal people.
Oh.
So I mean, I guess I find it a little strange that the argument now is that God is not saying anything. He's not being vocal because he's just waiting. He's just waiting to see how people are gonna react, and if they're gonna continue in their faith of supporting Trump and the idea that the election was stolen. And I just find it so strange that people fall for this, or really believe it. I don't know.
But it's their classic stick.
Maybe he has a cold and he has laryngitis, and there's anything.
It's just like fossils. Fossils are to test your faith. Fossils aren't real.
Right.
God put them there to test your faith. That's their classic out for anything like that. It's
They
testing
make
faith.
a prediction, they miss, they got to come up with some excuse, of course. So yeah.
I think it works though. The religious people I know, they do feel that when their life goes badly, or when someone does them wrong or, you know, whatever, their argument is like, God is testing me. And I just, you know, in my mind, I'm just like, no, I think it's because you effed up. Like,
Yeah, right. They don't want to admit that.
think,
They don't want to admit that, oh, yeah. I did
yeah,
something
it's
stupid.
like a way of pushing the blame or something, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, nah, I think that's your fault. But
I couldn't find my mascara this morning. I mean, I looked everywhere, and then I just thought, God is
Pray.
testing me.
I
He's
mean,
testing
prayed
me.
for it. Prayed for the
Same.
vision.
It was just
Oh, wow, yeah.
nowhere.
Yeah. Need I say it again?
Constant reminder.
Yep, here, our weekly reminder that religious beliefs have consequences. Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
boy, there you go, Trump.
Yep, there you go. There you go.
Wait,
This
wait.
is my
Thanks so much for that story. It definitely qualifies for our crazy story of the week. Well, that will wrap us up for this week. If you've enjoyed our program, please pass the word to your friends and associates, believers and non-believers alike. Again, just a reminder that you are welcome to post questions and comments on our Facebook page. Remember, there is a big difference between having good reasons for one accepts to be true and having bad ones. Incidentally, this is the only distinction one needs to become a strict atheist. This has been Dr. Brad for Abby, Tracy, and Tim saying so long.
See ya.